Well, welcome to you all to the research seminar as part of the Center for the Study of World Christianity. My name is Alex Chow, and in today's seminar, we are commemorating the work and the legacy of Professor Andrew Walls. Following the passing of Professor Walls, on August 12th of this year, at the ripe age of 93, a number of obituaries and reflections by colleagues around the globe cited a Christianity Today article, which described him as, quote, the most important person you don't know. However, to us who are gathered here today, especially those who are affiliated with the Center for the Study of World Christianity, he is perhaps the most important person we do know. Indeed, he has left an indelible mark on the field of world Christianity. He founded the center in 1982, then known as the Center for the Study of Christianity in the Non-Western World at the University of Aberdeen, before moving it to Edinburgh in 1987. He has trained several generations of scholars in a variety of fields, not only in world Christianity and mission studies, and we'll hear from various people about that today. But in 2018, on the occasion of Professor Walls's 90th birthday, we had in Edinburgh two occasions to celebrate Professor Walls and his legacy here in Edinburgh. The first was in June of that year at the Yale Edinburgh Conference, in which in this hall, the Rainey Hall, we had a ceilidh, a surprise ceilidh and a surprise birthday party for Professor Walls, with many notices coming from around the globe. But also later in 2018, in November of that year, at the School of Divinity's graduation ceremony, Professor Walls was presented with an honorary doctorate of divinity in recognition of his work. But as we will see today, Professor Walls's imprint can also be felt in other aspects of the academic world. Today we have brought together four former students and colleagues of Professor Walls, three who are here in Edinburgh and one who is joining us online from the United States, to speak to the life and the legacy of Professor Andrew Walls. And after that, we will have an open time for sharing for anybody online or in person who would like to say a word about Professor Walls, or even raise a question or comment to one of our panelists. Our first presenter for today is Margaret Acton. Margaret studied at New College and worked for a time at the National Library of Scotland before taking up a post in the center here in Edinburgh in 1988. She came to the center and worked initially with Professor Walls in a bibliography project for the International Review of Missions. And for 19 years was associated with the center. And along with her duties as with the project, Margaret also ran the center library and the archive and helped to organize the Yale Edinburgh Conference. I am told that she also had the very important responsibility of caffeinating the center and making sure coffee was provided, as well as the occasional provision of cake. So now I turn the time over to Margaret.
Thanks, Alex. I want to speak about Andrew Walls and libraries. One of the consistent themes in the tributes paid to him was his humility. And one of the aspects that I think was a bit overlooked was all his library and bibliographical work. And I would see his commitment to libraries, bibliographies, archives, as linked to his humility and his desire to serve other people. Little mentioned, I think because it was so long ago, was the fact that he began his academic career as the librarian at Tyndale House. There he set about building up a library for evangelical biblical scholarship. He was also responsible for stabilizing the finances of the new study centre. And I think too it's important that again, he was in a sort of slightly outsider role there, and that again, throughout his academic career, he has tended to be in a slightly outsider role. But this work laid an important foundation for his work in building up collections in Africa, and later in the Centre for the Study of Christianity in the Non-Western World, as it was known. If the subject area was going to grow, then it needed the foundational resources, and he set about acquiring these, and just as importantly, promoting them. His material resources were tiny, but it was astonishing what he managed to achieve. I would see it being in 5 distinct areas. First, there was building up a library. Secondly, there was collecting the archive resources. Thirdly, bibliography. Fourthly, publishing. And fifthly, there were the projects to provide or to help the survival of resources elsewhere. All of these were very closely interconnected. I don't think the library, certainly in Edinburgh, ever had a budget. Nothing was bought, everything was donated. Much, of course, was donated by Professor Walls himself. Other items came from students, colleagues, friends, academic visitors, because the collection increasingly attracted visitors from all over the world. By 2007, the collection comprised around 14,000 monographs, including many rare pamphlets, and around 4,000 periodical runs. These were mainly incomplete, but they were still valuable. Aside from the actual collecting, Professor Walls, very substantially helped by his wife Doreen, did a considerable amount of the day-to-day work. And one of my enduring images was of him at the top of a ladder, shelving periodicals, with Mrs. Walls hovering at floor level, passing things up to him to be shelved, and making sure the ladder stayed put. It certainly would not have been an activity that his cardiologist would have recommended. He refused for many years to use computers, and his attachment to the physical worlds of pen and paper or card was demonstrated by the endless writing of index cards. While Liz Leach and I catalogued the library online, he insisted on writing index cards for all the monographs himself, as well as the index cards for all the entries for the IRM. Mrs. Walls accessioned all the journals. I should say that he once spoke with feeling of having been invited to a card burning party. I think that might have been at Princeton or Yale. Archives. Many of you will have read his account of walking on the ashes of the church archives he collected in Nigeria. It was a truly heartbreaking experience, but not one that deterred him from archive collecting. And I think it made him all the more eager that resources should be copied and shared. I think in Aberdeen, this started slightly accidentally. He was offered the diaries of George Clark, China Inland Missionary to Yunnan and Shanxi, because nobody else was interested in looking after them. This was in 1969. And from then on, the centre acquired a reputation for being one of the few places interested in collecting missionary archives. One obvious source was the Church of Scotland. Their material mainly went to the National Library, of course, but a number of their very rare periodicals and monographs and maps were donated to us, and memorably, the lantern slide collection. This was stored in 121's attic. It obviously wasn't in daily use. The lift doesn't reach the attic, and lantern slides with their layers of glass and lead are extremely heavy. Professor Walls insisted on carrying absurd quantities of these downstairs and was very reluctant to accept my help. When we got them back to the library, he was delighted to find that the hall included the only photo he had seen of Mary Slessor wearing a hat. He took great joy in some of the trivia that he would come across in collections. Now, probably the most significant collection, and certainly the largest that we acquired, related to the Himalayas. A chance or providential meeting with Cindy Perry at Wheaton resulted in the Nepal Church History Archives coming to Edinburgh. In addition, through Cindy's good offices and in negotiation with Professor Walls, the archives from the United Mission to Nepal, the International Nepal Fellowship, and the Central Asia Fellowship followed. Betty Young, who had worked for UMN right from the very beginning, cared for these collections, which were a unique and probably the most complete record of the growth of Christianity in a country from both the national indigenous perspective and the missionary perspective. Again, as far as I know, no other institution was interested in collecting and housing this material. I think one factor that helped was that Professor Walls was known as a devout Christian, and individual donors and institutions were comfortable with entrusting their materials to somebody who sympathized and valued their contents. Bibliography. Another unsung role is he was the editor of the International Review of Mission, Bibliography of Mission Studies. Again, I think this started rather accidentally in 1972. The previous editor of the bibliography asked him if he would take it on, because he was the only person who ever regularly suggested items for inclusion. Now, this work entailed indexing some 300 to 400, sometimes more, items, monographs, journal articles, in a number of different languages, every 3 months, having it typed up, proofreading it, and sending it, usually at the last minute, to Geneva for publication. Now, this was work that he undertook for decades, work that served the scholarly community. It brought no rewards, but it alerted people to materials they would not otherwise necessarily have found. And he saw it as important enough to devote huge amounts of time to it. This work only ceased when Blackwell Wiley took over the publication and refused permission for us to retain the copyright. Publications. He founded, I think, 4 periodicals. Of these, only one survives. That's the Journal of Religion in Africa. From the library point of view, the most important one was the Bulletin of the Scottish Institute of Missionary Studies, because that was used to exchange with other periodicals, and therefore this helped build up our resources in Edinburgh. Fine projects. These had the aim of promoting and preserving collected materials. There was the cumulative bibliography of the International Review of Mission, aimed to make it easier to find the printed materials. There was the Africa Christianity Project. This Jim can tell us much more about, but this involved creating a bibliography, scanning materials, sharing resources among partner institutions, and it was a way of trying to make sure that unique items were copied, and if the originals were destroyed, there was still evidence of what had been. I should also say that Yale Edinburgh, which was founded in 1992, also always included a documentation session. So finally, I'd like to say that I see his legacy not simply in his students and all the academics that he mentored, wonderful as that legacy is, but it's also helped the physical survival of materials that otherwise might have been lost or languished unknown. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret, for that. I think one of the things that we often forget today is the significance of the library and the archive, because a lot of that has been moved from the new college location towards the central library in the university. But it is still a very key aspect of the legacy of the center, as well as its impact beyond. Our next presenter is Dr. Barbara Bompani, who is reader in Africa and International Development, and was until recently also the director of the Center of African Studies here in the University of Edinburgh. For many years, her research has investigated the relationships between religion, politics, and development, and more recently on religion and sexuality in Africa. Dr. Bompani completed her MSc and PhD in Edinburgh Center of African Studies. And if I'm not mistaken, one of the reasons she came to Edinburgh was out of a desire to study with Professor Andrew Walls. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bompani.
I would like to start expressing my deepest gratitude to the organizer for inviting me today in this building, in this beautiful room, with all of you to commemorate the life and work of a very special mentor, academic, and friend to me. I'm truly honored to share my memories, feelings, and personal story with you. I've initiated many presentations and talks in the past thanking organizers, but today these words assume even a more truthful meaning. This is because without Andrew and his influence in my personal and academic life, I wouldn't be based in this city today, and I wouldn't be working as an academic in this institution, collaborating with colleagues in this school. Indeed, as has been just said, it is thanks to him that I relocated myself to Edinburgh at the Center of African Studies, where I completed my doctoral program and where I developed my career in the School of Social and Political Science, a few blocks away from the school. Towards the end of 2002, while I was moving back from South Africa to my home country, that is Italy, ready to work on a doctoral program, I came to Scotland to visit my partner, a Scottish postdoctoral fellow working in Johannesburg at the time at the University of the Witwatersrand. He was spending his Christmas holiday with his family in Dundee, where I've been invited as well. Until then, I had very few encounters with and knowledge about this country, including very poor knowledge of the weather and the level of rain precipitation as today we have so much rain here. Then I was a postgraduate student in the field of Christianity in Africa. As I said, I didn't know much about this country, but I knew about Professor Andrew Walls. I knew that he was Scottish and he was living in Scotland. At the time, I was doing research on African independent churches in Soweto, in South Africa, looking at how these churches frequently were labeled as apolitical, aloof from politics, while my data, my observation, but mostly, more importantly, my participants were telling me that a lot of political action, thinking, and discussion were taking place there. Perhaps their kind of politics wasn't organized and supporting political parties, movements, or associations as expected, but politics was at the heart of their theology, had importance on their lived experience, and churches were helping their members to make sense of the political scenario in apartheid and post-apartheid South Africa. Through the reading of Andrew's work, I understood that lenses matter and training matters. The point of view we use to read phenomena is vital. That Christianity, as well as in my case, its relation with politics, was dominantly being read through European eyes and European experience. In Andrew's introduction to his book, Crossing Cultural Frontiers, Studies in the History of World Christianity, he talks about a sort of eureka moment in his own doctoral studies, when he understood that due to the geographical, linguistic, and cultural range of the Roman Empire, cultural diversity was built in the life itself of the church from the early days, and that cultural diversity needed to be understood within church expression. Similarly to his eureka moment, inspired by Andrew's work, I understood that if I couldn't apply my European lenses to the reading of what constituted politics in these religious communities, their interpretation of the political sphere, that through their holistic approach was not a secular independent space, was a continuum with the religious and spiritual space. Politics through my European training meant belonging to and supporting political parties and organizations. But through the unpacking of cultural diversity, the intersection of religion and politics acquired new meanings in my analysis. African independent churches were, after all, political spaces, but not in the way I was accustomed to. So going back to my personal story, I knew that while in Scotland, I had to meet this famous professor. I sent him a brief email around Christmas, not really hoping in an answer, but Andrew replied in his usual kind, welcoming, and warm style, and invited me for a meeting at the then Center for the Study of Northwestern Christianity, that at the time was just outside this building. I couldn't believe the luck and the privilege. On the 3rd of January, he came down from Aberdeen to meet me. It was an incredibly cold day. I asked the then my partner, now my husband, to wait outside on the bench in front of Divinity, thinking that I was going to spend only a few minutes with Professor Walls. But Andrew was Andrew. With his encyclopedic knowledge and his generosity in allocating time to his guests, he introduced me to the material collected by the center, as Margaret said, to the Harold Turner archive that became so important to my future work. And later, and he answered questions and opened new inquiries. He also introduced the idea of me moving to work at the University of Edinburgh. And given my area of interest, he suggested to contact the Center of African Studies, with which Andrew strictly collaborated. In short, instead of a minute, the meeting lasted 3 hours. When I left the building, I found my husband frozen on the bench, shaking, and I apologized, and then told him we should relocate here in Edinburgh. I've already used the word repositioning and relocating so many times in this contribution, and that is because repositioning is exactly the word that assume particular value when thinking of Andrew to me. Of course, there is the very practical influence of him in my decision to join and move to the Center of African Studies in Edinburgh, first for the PhD and then as a member of staff. A center that was strongly supported by Andrew in difficult and less difficult times, as my colleagues Pravina and Kenneth King, who are here in the audience and who led the center for many years, can testify. An highlight, for example, was the very important conference that Andrew organized for the Center of African Studies in '92, along with Christopher Fife, an historian and Africanist. A conference that brought to cast academics as Kwame Bigyako, Adrian Hastings, Lamin Sane to discuss Christianity in Africa. And with fond memories at our center, we remember Andrew attending and contributing to our weekly seminar series, also with his wife, Ingrid. But I also think of the word repositioning when I think about Andrew's pioneering intellectual contribution in recentering Africa in the study of Christianity, highlighting the importance and leading role that African Christianity plays in global setting, and also in reconciling the pre-Christian time with the Christian one, in reading Christianity in its entirety, and not along fragmented classification as pro and post-colonial. I smile when I think that Andrew, very humbly, used to say he didn't do much for African studies, if not founding the Journal of Religion in Africa and Teaching in Africa, but actually his intellectual contribution decisively shaped my field and speaks to very timely, important, ongoing decolonial conversation that are happening in my discipline. And these were ahead of time. To me, Andrew also reconfigured my relational academic understanding of mentorship. Indeed, his welcoming and generous attendance to colleagues, including junior students, shaping me the idea of what good academic praxis is and should be. Andrew was not my supervisor, but he was always present as a mentor, guiding me and reading my work in moments of challenges. He was always available for a coffee in the Royal Mile. He posted to my office print material that could help my work, always accompanied by warm notes in a handwriting style that, to be honest, was very difficult to read. He attended events that I organized. He invited me to events that he organized. He was always extremely kind, generous, and warm, a very important guiding presence in my academic life. In a certain way, I also think that Andrew will have an influence in repositioning my future work. Indeed, when I attended here in Divinity in 2017, Andrew's seminar entitled European Christianity, the Missionary Movement, and the Rebirth of World Christianity, it threw an important question to the audience. That was about the lack of written history on the dynamics of the Pentecostal movements in Uganda. Quite provocatively, he highlighted the fact that much of the existing studies, mine included, were based on the present, and that more historical work needed to be done in order to understand this movement. I'm not an historian, although I've been trained as an undergraduate as an historian, but this point keeps reverberating in my mind, and in some way, I've already started to address this issue in my recent work. Perhaps Andrew will continue to reposition in my professional life, because this is what extraordinary people do. They keep influencing us, even after their departure. As they say in West Africa, where Andrew lived and worked extensively, when an extraordinary person dies, a great tree falls. A similar image is used by the American poet and civic rights activist Maya Angelou in her famous poem, When Great Trees Fall. There is a particular passage in that poem that I would like to read. And when great souls die, after a period, peace blooms, slowly and always irregularly. Spaces fill with a kind of soothing electric vibration. Our senses restored, never to be the same, whisper to us, they existed, we can be and be better, for they existed. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Dr. Bompani for sharing that. I think it's quite important to recognize the significance of Professor Wald beyond just world Christianity. And I think his relationship with the Center for African Studies in particular is testimony to that. For our next speaker, we're going to switch to online to the United States. Our third presenter is joining us from Emory University, Professor Jehu Hanciles, who is D.W. and Ruth Brooks Professor of Christianity, World Christianity at Candler School of Theology of Emory University. He is perhaps best known for his work, his research on the history of the global expansion of Christianity through migration, and has published 2 monographs on the subject, with the most recent one being published this year by Urbans. But prior to this work, Professor Hanciles' first monograph was based on his PhD in the center here in Edinburgh. Completed in 1995, his PhD was entitled Euthanasia of a Mission. And it focused on mission strategies in Sierra Leone, indigenous Christian responses, and the growth of African nationalism. Please join me in welcoming Professor Hanciles.
I am very grateful for this opportunity given me by the organizers to share, to be with and to share with you. My remarks today will focus not on Andrew Waltz's outsized global contribution, but his deep influence on my own personal journey as a scholar. Now, my story has many unique elements, but I would be bold to say that in many ways it reflects the experiences of a whole generation of scholars that were shaped by or influenced by Andrew Waltz. Well, my story, perhaps it was destined to be. Andrew Waltz taught at Frobe College in Sierra Leone, my homeland, from 1957. In case you're wondering, that was long before my time. But that said, I encountered Andrew Waltz in his writings while I was an undergraduate student at Frobe College. Now, how I came to study with Waltz is a complex story involving unexpected encounters and happenstance. In 1988 or 89, Elizabeth Grant, one of Waltz's PhD students, arrived in Freetown, Sierra Leone, to conduct some research on the early 19th century Christian community in Sierra Leone. Liz Grant is, I believe, currently director of the Global Health Academy at Edinburgh University. In any case, at that time, I had started master's studies with a focus on the native pastorate experiment. More importantly, I was involved in a daunting project that involved sorting, organizing, and classifying volumes of archival material of the Sierra Leone Church, which had been literally dumped in a dusty room at the Bishop's Court. So in any case, Liz was directed to me, and of course, many conversations followed. She told me all about Waltz and the center. One thing led to another. It culminated in my move to Edinburgh and enrollment in the Center for the Study of Christianity in the Non-Western World. The memory of my first meeting with Professor Waltz in September 1990 is firmly etched in my mind, not because he startled me by greeting me in Creole, my mother tongue and the lingua franca of Sierra Leone, not because of the freezing cold temperatures. I arrived in Edinburgh in early fall, not too long after leaving the tropical climes of Freetown, but because I was immediately struck by Andrew Waltz's warm and kindly disposition. In the event, that first meeting marked my transition into a new world of learning and mentorship that was life transforming. Friends, over the course of my academic career, many great individuals have contributed to my intellectual development in meaningful ways. But I want to say today, no other individual shaped my intellectual life and scholarship more intimately or more profoundly than Andrew Waltz. And I want to describe this by pointing to three areas. The first is this: Andrew Waltz helped me to grasp the significance of African Christianity. I had already fallen in love with historical studies as an undergraduate student. I graduated with a BA in history and sociology. But by the time I graduated, I was already experiencing growing dissatisfaction with the poor coverage in church history material of African voices and the African contribution. This was what had piqued my interest in the native pastorate experiment to begin with. So I got to Edinburgh with my head full of questions, eager to absorb new ideas, ready and ripe for the whole new world of knowledge and understanding that the Center for the Study of Christianity in the Non-Western World had to offer. I believe I can make this claim that I was the center's model or ideal candidate. Now, if you know Andrew Waltz through his numerous writings, you're obviously familiar with the wealth of ideas and arguments that have come to define his contribution to world Christianity. I don't mean to brag, but sitting in class and being taught by him on a regular basis for a long time was next level, as my kids would say. Now, my formation as an African scholar had begun long before I met Andrew Waltz. As an undergrad at Furby College, I was taught by eminent Christian scholars, two of the first generation of leading African theologians who had begun to challenge Western intellectual models and formulate African perspectives, in fact. So I had excellent preparation for my tutelage under Andrew Waltz. But studying with him was deeply formative. And he did so up close and personal, through intimate interaction and exchange, through patient and penetrating responses to my questions and stumbling inquiries, with feedback full of rich insight and riveting stories, often told with a twinkle in his eye. Andrew Waltz's teaching and ideas, particularly his reappraisal of the Western missionary movement and his analysis of the southward shift in global Christianity's center of gravity, were breathtaking and important. But initially, at least, the most fundamental shift in my thinking had to do with my understanding of the African experience. Waltz's tutelage cultivated, refashioned, and transformed my understanding of the African world. His writings on various major topics like the concept of primal religions, his views on religious conversion, his assessment of the significance of African Christianity beyond a narrow focus on AICs, equipped me with conceptual and analytical tools that remain central to my thinking to this day. Some of you may know that I dedicated my book, Beyond Christendom, to him with this notation that he taught me to see the world through African eyes. The second area I want to point to is that studying under Andrew Waltz, for me, laid the foundation for my understanding of world Christianity. I wish I could say this was an instantaneous process. I wish I could tell you that I took immediate advantage of the feast of profound ideas and penetrating insights I was exposed to as Wals's student. But the truth of the matter is, I did not quite have the mental capacity initially to fully process and absorb much of Andrew Wals's copious output. My own intellectual maturity was not far enough along at the time to take in what he had to offer. It would take a few years before I became fully aware of the full force and subversive nature of his thinking. I began to understand that a single master narrative of the history of Christianity centered around Western initiatives and approaches is liable to produce a distorted understanding. But it took a little bit more time to fully grasp what it meant to imagine the story of Christianity as a global story. What it meant to say that a global perspective is indispensable for, in his words, a vision of Christian history which reflects its position as a faith present throughout the world. On a more practical vein, that a global history of Christianity or a historical study of Christianity from a global perspective clearly requires new historiography and new analytic constructs. I don't mind admitting that Wals's thought on the principle of translation, also propounded by Lamin Sanneh, remains for me one of the most vital units of analysis in my own scholarship. On this note, I want to say it took me longer than I would like to admit to realize or fully appreciate two major traits of Andrew Walls. The first was that Walls was a theologian. He is a patristic scholar who became a world-renowned historian of world Christianity. But I would suggest that much of his writings and contributions were profoundly theological. Think of some of those titles you're familiar with: The Gospel as a Prisoner and Liberator of Culture, The Translation Principle in Christian History, Romans 1 as and the Modern Missionary Movement, or the Ephesian Movement. Take his claim, I quote, that the representation of Christ by any one segment of human society in any period of history are limited and imperfect, that all the representations are needed for the realization of the full stature of Christ. Claims like this, in my mind, are both historical, but also profoundly theological. The other aspect of Walls that it took me quite a while to appreciate fully was that Walls was, I'm going to just say this, a revolutionary. See, by the time I met Walls in person and came under his mentorship, he was already in his early 50s. Only much later would I wonder about the steely determination and intellectual courage it took for him to take on the theological establishment, to poke the bear, so to speak. For those of us still struggling to explain world Christianity to our colleagues or make the case for non-Western voices and experiences as part of the required curriculum, imagine the courage it took so many decades ago for Walls to champion a revisioning of the historical study of Christianity that, even in his own words, would require something analogous to a Copernican revolution. Perhaps as a Scotsman, the spirit of rebelliousness and insurrection that flowed so emphatically in the veins of his ancestors also pulsated through him. But Andrew Walls modeled the shrewd subversiveness that was and remains a hallmark of good world Christianity scholarship. I don't think we can fully appreciate his towering impact without recognizing that it not only issued from a first-rate intellect, it issued from a first-rate intellect combined with fierce conviction, courageous scholarship, and mischief-making, all wrapped up in a wry, disarming smile and sharp wit. But anyway, to my last area, I know I'm running out of time. Friends, I have to say this, I became an unrepentant Walesian. And believe you me, it is a thing. You know, in 2007, I was invited to give the inaugural lecture for the opening of the Crowther Center for Mission Education in Oxford. And I chose the title, "In the Shadow of the Elephant." This phrase was derived from a West African proverb which states that if you go through the high grass where the elephant has already gone through, you don't get soaked with the dew. Friends, in the years since I studied under Andrew Walls, I have grown in my own scholarship and my intellectual horizons have widened. I have foraged into new discourses, identified new co-conspirators, including some participants in this Zoom event. I have developed expertise, pursued research projects in adjacent fields of study, including globalization and migration. I suppose, like many PhD students, I originally viewed my time at the center as a training ground that equipped me to leave, to pursue my own scholarly endeavors, that prepared me to plow my own furrow in the world, so to speak. Yet I have found out over the decades since that I often pursued fresh inquiries, foraged into new discourses, only to discover that Andrew Walls was ahead of me. Perhaps this reveals my ignorance of the breadth of his scholarship. Or maybe it indicates that the fruit doesn't fall far from the tree. I will leave this for others to judge. But let me give you one example. When I took up migration studies in the early 2000s, I had absolutely no idea that a few years previously, Andrew Walls had published an article titled "The Diaspora Factor in Christian History" that covered exactly the intellectual terrain I had set my sights on. Of course, my astonishment quickly gave way to appreciation, since his assessment not only gave me new insights, but also allowed me to refine my analysis and central thesis. Friends, Andrew Walls' erudition, gentle instruction, shrewd counsel have decisively shaped the priorities and core interests of my academic scholarship. In my case, at least, his influence is much too formative to be outgrown. And so let me just conclude by saying I count it as one of the greatest blessings of my life that I have been and continue to reap enormous intellectual benefits from walking in Andrew Walls' shadow. Thank you.
For our final speaker, we return to here in Edinburgh, to Professor James Cox, Emeritus Professor of Religious Studies in the University of Edinburgh. Professor Cox is perhaps best known for his work in indigenous religions, with particular emphasis on Africa, the Arctic, and Australia. And he has taught religious studies here he has taught religious studies in a number of universities, from Alaska to Zimbabwe to New Zealand, as well as here in Edinburgh. First appointed in 1993, and eventually retiring as chair of religious studies in 2011. With this history, students may be surprised to find that Professor Cox's earlier work was in mission history. Professor Cox has the distinguished honor of our panelists of being one of Professor Walls' earlier students, completing his PhD in 1977 in the University of Aberdeen, looking at the mission theology of A.G. Hogg, the principal of Madras Christian College from 1928 to 1938. And he studied, of course, with Professor Andrew Walls. Please join me in welcoming Professor Cox.
Well, I want to thank Alex Chow for inviting me to take part in this seminar, recognizing the legacy of Andrew Walls in so many different ways. My connection to Andrew Walls, as was noted by Alex, began quite some time ago. In 1973, I wrote to him asking about a PhD in religious studies in the University of Aberdeen, but my topic was very much unclear in my mind. Andrew's response to me was welcoming, encouraging, and he set out for me in his letter an idea about how I could proceed with my PhD studies. I applied, and in 1974, I was admitted into the postgraduate program at the University of Aberdeen with Andrew Walls as my supervisor. He was a hard taskmaster in many ways, gentle, yes, but he was definitely one who pushed me. I remember he asked me to write a short but indicative essay to give him an idea of how my writing might proceed. I was pleased to do this. I wrote it, I submitted it, and I received back one comment at the bottom of this essay, UGH, U-G-H, exclamation point. I thought, what was that about? I talked with him, and he said, "You are trying to be far too academic, far too precious." And he said to me, "Here's my advice. When you write as if you are aiming your comments for someone who is 16 years of age." I took that on board and have tried to make my writing ever since accessible to a wide audience. Of course, Andrew himself had a writing style that was exemplary, always flowing and entirely accessible. Well, I wanted to say just a few words about him as my mentor. When I began my PhD studies, he set out a plan with me. The first year, I did extensive research, background research in the whole area, as Alex said, about the history of mission, particularly in the 19th century in India, so I could understand the later work of A.G. Hogg. Near the end of my first year, into the second year, I wrote an outline of what I intended to do, and then I began the writing process, which I devoted mostly to in the third year. And I set up a program with Andrew Walls, which worked very well. I wrote a chapter, gave it to his secretary, made an appointment to see him in about 3 or 4 weeks. He then would read the chapter, make notes on it, meet with me, talk to me about it. At the same time, I'd been working on my next chapter. And then I submitted that at the time when I had my discussion with him. This went on chapter after chapter, period after period, so that by the time I finished in April 1977, Andrew Walls and I had discussed not just 1 level, 2 levels, but at least 3 or 4 levels of each chapter. And it was then that Andrew and I were satisfied with the work as it stood. And I really am grateful to Andrew Walls for the diligence he gave to reading my work and for his patience in offering suggestions and then further suggestions and revisions. And I remember receiving a phone call from him after my examination. I answered and he said simply, "Is this Dr. Cox?" And of course, that was a form of address with which I was entirely unfamiliar. Well, I returned to Aberdeen briefly in 1986 to work as an honorary fellow in the Department of Religious Studies, which was closing at the University of Aberdeen. And I worked a little bit helping him with the collection that he was moving in his library, which Margaret spoke about, certainly not so extensive as she worked with, but moving it to the Center for the Study of Christianity in the Non-Western World in Edinburgh, which was moved 1986-87. He had founded this center in 1982 in Aberdeen. In 1993, I returned from Zimbabwe and I was appointed as convener or the sort of coordinator of the African Christianity Project, which was a project looking at African institutions and involving African institutions in the work of the project. It was sponsored and funded by the Pew Charitable Trusts, which Andrew had obtained in a 6-year grant. And I worked with Andrew under his mentorship then for 2 years until 1995, also with John Parrott, who was the associate director of the center, and then David Kerr, who took over in 1995 at Andrew's retirement. But I continued to maintain close relationships with Andrew, at least until 2011, when I retired from my post in religious studies here in the University of Edinburgh. Now this brings me to the next section with which I want to discuss. That is to comment briefly on Andrew Wall's contribution to religious studies. Of course, he is known internationally for his respected work in the study of Christian missions, but his important impact on religious studies is often underestimated. After he returned to the UK from Nigeria in 1966 to take up a post in church history in the University of Aberdeen, he became known in religious studies as a scholar of religions with a specialization in the recent history of Christianity in sub-Saharan Africa. In 1970, he founded the first religious studies department in Scotland. 3 years prior, in 1967, Ninian Smart had founded the first religious studies department at the University of Lancaster in the UK, but Andrew Walls founded the first department in Scotland. And he situated it in the Faculty of Arts and Social Studies, rather than the Faculty of Divinity, where it might have been expected to have been located. He described the purpose of the department, to quote him, as the study of religion in its own terms and in its social, phenomenological, and historical aspects. This approach underscored a theme which he repeated throughout his writings, that religion is a subject in its own right, distinct from either theology or the social sciences, one which is best understood through an empathetic approach that includes the perspectives of believers in any eventual interpretation of its meaning. It's also important to note that Andrew contributed to religious studies in the UK by being an important member of the then British Association for the History of Religions, which is now the British Association for the Study of Religions. He became president of the BAHR in 1977, and he made an immediate impact on the association by organizing the BAHR annual conference in 1978 on the theme, The Understanding of Mission in the Study of Religion, which was a theme I don't think has been repeated by the BAHR, BASR since, the study of mission, the understanding of mission in the study of religion. A special issue of the journal Religion, published in 1980, was dedicated to Andrew Wall's colleague and close friend, Geoffrey Parander, on the occasion of Parander's 70th birthday. As one of the contributors to the journal, Andrew chose to explain his own theoretical understanding of the study of religion. He argued, as I said before, the study of religion is a field in its own right, but it's irreducible, he said, to the many disciplines that contribute to its understanding. He acknowledged that the disciplines can be and must be applied to the study of religion, but he insisted that religion, to quote him, is a well-nigh universal dimension of human life, and its manifestations in one place may illuminate its manifestations elsewhere. His non-reductionist position was confirmed when he wrote, "Religion can best understand religion." He explained further that religious commitment provides the best entrance gate for understanding religion because, quoting him, it at least presupposes the reality of its subject matter. And this reminds me of a story he told me in one of our conversations. He said early on, he said there are two centers for religious studies in the UK. One is at Lancaster and one is at Aberdeen. Lancaster, founded by Ninian Smart, whose contribution had to do with dimensions of religion and his important idea of methodological agnosticism. But Andrew said to me, the difference between religious studies at Lancaster and religious studies at Aberdeen is that one believes in God and the other doesn't. He said, I'll leave you to decide which is which. Well, he then went on to say, if religion is a universal dimension of human life, there must be a basic primary form that underlies its concrete manifestation in diverse cultures everywhere throughout history. He called this the primal element, the primal component, which is found at the base of every religion and provides for all religions their elemental and common understandings. This is explained, he thought, why many societies around the world share foundational ideas and why the universal religions cannot be understood apart from the way they incorporate primal concepts within their worldviews. As the universal religions interact with primal religions, new religions emerge. This could be seen particularly in the development of Christianity in Africa, where, Andrew writes, quoting him, the old religions form the substructure of African Christianity. The scholar cannot ignore this vital relationship, he said, neither in life nor in study. Neither of these can the two be separated. For religious studies, it's Andrew's recognition of what he called the primal stratum that is probably his most lasting legacy. As early as 1976, he inaugurated at Aberdeen a one-year top master's program, the MLit in Religion in Primal Societies, the aim of which he described as the study of the primal or ethnic or traditional religions characteristic of many societies in Africa, the Americas, Asia, and Oceania, the effects on belief systems, practices, and religious institutions of the meeting of these religions with universal religions, notably Christianity and Islam, and the new religious movements arising after contact with Western influences. Today, we generally refer to primal religions as indigenous religions, many of which continue to explore in the study of indigenous religions, the interaction between local religious expressions and global influences by focusing on contextualized religion. In this sense, Andrew Walls was truly a visionary figure within religious studies. Testimony of his continued influence is confirmed by the increasing number of academic programs around the world devoted to the study of indigenous religions in their multifaceted and complex manifestations. In my view, it is the manner by which Professor Andrew Walls analyzed the impact of cultural change on indigenous societies that marks his primary contribution to the academic study of religions.
Thank you very much to Professor Cox for the sharing. That not only the sharing as a student, as a former student of Professor Walls, and the impact that he has had on your education and your training, but also in terms of religious studies, which I think is something that many do not recognize about Professor Walls and his impact. Thank you very much for that.
It struck me by the time we came to the end that what I remembered about Andrew Walls hadn't quite come over. A lot had come over, but the bit I remember is how involved he was in local politics. And he was for a long time a local councillor in Aberdeen. And I don't quite know what happened later, but I imagine life got too busy when he came down here to split between local politics, Aberdeen and Edinburgh, and something had to go. Or maybe he stayed as a local politician because he was very much respected as a local Labour politician. And I kind of know more about this because my husband did the same thing. So there were two local university people who were very involved in Labour politics. And I think that's rather nice to remember that at the moment when we're going through all these ructions. But I know my husband admired him very much for keeping the two sides of his life in parallel. Thank you.
I must mention Andrew's capacity to relate to young people. Shortly after he and Ingrid were married, they were visiting here in the States in Western Pennsylvania, and we held a small reception for them in our home. And people were looking forward to talking to Andrew, but he spent all of his time with the 3 or 4 teenagers present over in the corner. One of them had perceptively asked, because he knew Ingrid before they were married, is this Mr. Walls good enough for our Ingrid? A couple of years later, our 2 granddaughters, then in high school, were with us on a trip for a couple of weeks in England and Scotland. And sitting in the living room of the Walls home in Aberdeen for a wee bite and sup for an hour or so, Andrew sat with the 2 young women and said, "I've been having trouble sorting my papers because I have always thought that every time before you throw something away, you should make 2 copies."
Kenneth King. My contribution to James's UG factor in one's educational safari is one of the first things I wrote for Andrew Wall, for Christopher Fife. He simply wrote at the bottom of it, "Avoid Presbyterian English." So it's the same kind of thing as James has mentioned. You know, don't start getting into the academic blah blah. Make it clear and straightforward, not too many footnotes. I think the other thing that was Anne Wigglesworth, by the way, who was talking up here, and also about her husband. But I think one of the other reasons that I could never work out why, after coming down here to Edinburgh after Aberdeen was unwise enough to close down religious studies, no need for God up there, why did he not come down here? And I think the reason is not only what Anne referred to, his involvement in Aberdeen, or Aberdeen, as he would say, Aberdeen politics, but also he was deeply involved in the Methodist circuit. He unlike Lancaster, he actually believed in God, and a version of the Methodist God, actually, and he believed in singing and washing up dishes, by the way, if he was visiting somebody. But he would go to quite small Methodist churches on the northeast coast and preach, you know, in amongst all his other work. And the other reason he stayed in Aberdeen was because you could get Aberdeen butteries up there. In fact, the most recent thing he sent down to us from Aberdeen through his dear wife Ingrid were 8 batteries. Those of you who don't know what batteries are, wise up. They're pretty awful, actually. They're a Scottish version of a croissant, but they are as far away from a croissant as you can imagine. The last thing to say about Andrew is that Pravina, who is here, and I went up to his funeral and to his interment in a little village north of Aberdeen called Fyvie. And the most moving thing about both was that the majority of people in the Methodist Church off Union Street in Aberdeen were African, the majority. And at his interment, majority of people, as he was committed to the earth, were African. And 2 of them from Zimbabwe, as he went, they sang to the tune of Auld Lang Syne, what they sing in Zimbabwe when someone is buried. And the local minister was so moved by this, he said, could they do it again? And everyone joined in. And I thought it was very nice that those of us who are Africanists sometimes don't invite any Africans to come to an African seminar. And he always had Africans in African seminars here, and we tried to do the same in the Center of African Studies that Barbara was talking about. I have a copy of the book, 2 copies if anybody doesn't know it, done by Christopher Fife and Andrew Walls on Christianity in Africa, 1994, published by the Center of African Studies. That is a really super book, and 2 articles in it by Andrew Walls are first rate. On theology. I've got a couple of copies here if you want them.
Yes, I just want to thank you, Alex, and University of Edinburgh for this incredibly lovely occasion. I wish I could be there with you there in Scotland. But in light of what Jehu and James were sharing about Andrew's outlier status, you might say, a theologian in the religious studies world, a religious studies person in the theology world. It shouldn't be forgotten that Laman and Andrew started there together in the religious studies department at Aberdeen. And I just wonder if either Jehu or James or others may want to comment on this dynamic duo who really launched a new field called world Christianity that people are trying to make sense of today in various ways.
I'm not sure what can be said. I think it's important to recognize that partnership and collaboration, reflecting on Andrew's part, not only this deep, profound commitment to Africa, African Christianity, but I said earlier, that the principle of translation, for me, which they both, expanded on and analyzed and explained and applied to the issue of Christianity in such illuminating ways, remains for me, a primary, unit of analysis in my own work, as well. But I think it's absolutely right to say that collaboration needs to be recognized as foundational to the emergence of the field of world Christianity. I was actually a student at Edinburgh when the Yale Edinburgh conference was established or inaugurated, and it was obvious even then that this was something that was new, that was fresh, and that was going to have significant impact. We shouldn't forget the other, I would say, musketeer in that sort of relationship, Kwame Bediako, who also spent time at the center while I was there. That yes, I mean these were powerhouses of sort of intellectual innovation and pioneers of the study of world Christianity. And it's absolutely right as we commemorate Andrew Walls, to recognize that those partnerships were crucial also to the legacy that he leaves behind, scholarly and otherwise.
Well, thank you very much, Jehu, for that remark. I think that in many ways highlights really the legacy of Professor Andrew Walls is quite multifaceted, not only in terms of his scholarship and the subversive nature of some of his work, but also the people that he impacted, and also the archives and the material history that was that came after his handiwork. I would like to close our time with a few words actually from Professor Walls himself. And I would like to read just a couple words from the conclusion of his last book, Crossing Cultural Frontiers. And he wrote these words about missiology in particular, but I think you can appreciate that they were in many ways quite autobiographical. Professor Walls writes, "Missiologists are the magpies of the academic world. They invade the scholarly territory of their neighbors and steal their topics. We invade the biblical field, the theological field, the historical field, and the practical field in the name of the study of mission. When the theologians, biblical scholars, church historians, practical theologians are alert to the missiological aspects of their task, we are not really needed. But as with washing up, what everyone is meant to do, no one does. So in practice, missiologists voluntarily undertake everyone else's washing up. This also makes us academic subversives, upsetting harmony by raising new issues, introducing new perspectives, new data, identifying new questions and problems within established fields, exploring the missiological dimensions of topics already discussed by our theological colleagues, and also placing issues raised by Christian activity before our colleagues in the humanities and social sciences. Is there any more exciting vocation at the present time than missiology? I, who am nearing the end of my course, must envy those of you with many years to serve. May God speed you. We are privileged to have known and to know a bit more tonight of this magpie, of this academic subversive, Professor Andrew Finley Walls. Thank you very much for joining us.